May 1945. Netherlands. Private David Walsh sat on the steps of a destroyed church in Rotterdam, holding a can of beef stew he couldn't eat. He'd been a soldier for 3 years. Normandy, Belgium, Germany. He'd seen men die. He'd killed men. He'd walked through destroyed cities and bombed villages. He thought he'd seen everything war could do to people. But this morning, he'd watched a 6-year-old boy eat a piece of bread, and it had broken something inside him that combat never touched. The boy's name was Carol. David didn't know that yet. All David knew was that when he'd handed the bread to this skeletal child with huge eyes and hollow cheeks, the boy had grabbed it with both hands, shoved the entire piece into his mouth at once, and then started crying while he chewed. Not crying from joy, not crying from relief, crying from fear that someone would take the food away before he could swallow it. David had 4 younger brothers back home in Nova Scotia. The youngest was 7, about Carol's age. David tried to imagine his little brother Michael so starved that a piece of bread would make him cry with fear, and he couldn't. His brain refused to create that image. That's when David realized he'd been fighting Germans for 3 years, but he'd never truly understood what they'd done until this moment. This is the story of David Walsh and the De Vries family. A story about what happens when a soldier trained to destroy meets children who've forgotten how to trust. About how healing trauma requires patience that military training never taught. And about why one Canadian private spent the rest of his life returning to the Netherlands every Liberation Day to visit the family he couldn't save, but helped survive. 3 days earlier, May 2nd, 1945. David's unit, the North Nova Scotia Highlanders, had been stationed outside Rotterdam waiting for the German surrender. They'd been briefed about conditions inside the city: starvation, disease, desperation. The officers used words like humanitarian crisis and severe malnutrition. David heard the words, but didn't understand them. Not really. He understood combat. He understood wounded soldiers. He understood death, but severe malnutrition, that was just words. On May 5th, the Germans surrendered. On May 6th, David's unit entered Rotterdam. The city looked like hell had visited and decided to stay. Buildings reduced to shells, streets cratered by bombs, rubble everywhere. But David had seen destroyed cities before. What he hadn't seen was the people. They moved like ghosts. Thin, not soldier thin from hard rations and marching, but concentration camp thin. Bones visible through clothes. Eyes too large for faces. Moving slowly because they had no energy. Some had swollen bellies and legs from edema. Their bodies so starved they were retaining fluid. The children were worst. Children should run and play and make noise. These children moved in slow motion, sat quietly, stared with ancient eyes that had seen too much. David's sergeant, Tom Mackenzie, was a father of 3. He took one look at the children and had to walk away. David found him behind a ruined building, vomiting. "I can't," Mackenzie said, wiping his mouth. "I can't look at them without seeing my kids." What kind of people starve children on purpose? David had no answer. Meeting the De Vries family, May 7, 1945. David's unit set up a field kitchen in a school courtyard. They'd been ordered to establish feeding stations and wait for Dutch volunteers to distribute food. The brass thought children might be less frightened if other Dutch people handed them meals. But many Dutch adults were too weak to help, and the children wouldn't come near the school. They watched from hiding spots behind walls, in rubble, through broken windows, but wouldn't approach. David understood. To these kids, soldiers were soldiers. They'd spent years hiding from men in uniforms. The fact that these uniforms were slightly different colors didn't matter. Soldiers meant danger. On the 3rd day, David saw Carol. The boy was crouched behind a pile of bricks about 50 feet from the field kitchen, watching. He'd been there for an hour, not moving, just watching the soldiers cook and distribute food. David grabbed a piece of bread, fresh bread from the Canadian supplies, something these children probably hadn't tasted in years, and walked slowly toward the boy. Carol started to run. "Wait," David said in English, then tried the Dutch phrase he'd been taught. "Wacht, ik wil helpen." "Wait, I want to help." Carol stopped, but didn't turn around. He was maybe 10 feet away. poised to run. David crouched down to look smaller, less threatening. He held out the bread where Carol could see it, then carefully placed it on the ground. Then he backed away. 20 feet, 30 feet, far enough that Carol might feel safe approaching. It took 15 minutes. Carol kept looking at the bread, looking at David, looking at the bread. Finally, he crept forward, grabbed the bread, and ran. But he didn't run far. He ran to a building about 30 yards away, dove through a window, and disappeared inside. David returned to the field kitchen. Mission accomplished, 1 kid fed. That was something. 10 minutes later, Carol reappeared, with a woman and 3 other children. The woman was clearly Carol's mother, same eyes, same thin face. But she looked ancient. David later learned she was 32 years old. She looked 60. Starvation does that. The other children were Carol's sisters. Anna, 8, Sophie, 5, and Maria, 3. All skeletal, all terrified, all staring at the field kitchen where food was. David watched them from a distance. The mother was clearly trying to decide if approaching was safe. She'd pull the children back, then take a step forward. Back, forward. The calculus of desperation. Risk the soldiers or watch your children starve. Finally, she made her decision. She took Anna's hand, picked up Maria, and walked slowly toward the field kitchen with Carol and Sophie following. David met them halfway. He kept his rifle on his shoulder, hands visible and empty. He nodded to the mother and said the Dutch phrase he'd practiced. U bent veilig, wij hebben eten. You're safe. We have food. The mother, Margaretha de Vries, though David didn't know her name yet, stared at him. Her eyes filled with tears. She said something in rapid Dutch that David didn't understand. One of the Dutch volunteers approached and translated. She says she doesn't believe you. She says soldiers lie. She says last week German soldiers told people there was food distribution. And when people came, they took the men for forced labor. David felt something twist in his chest. Of course she didn't believe him. Why would she? He looked at the volunteer. Tell her I understand. Tell her I won't come closer. Tell her my sergeant over there, he pointed to Mackenzie, has 3 daughters. Tell her we're fathers and brothers and we're here to help. The volunteer translated. Margaretha stared at David for a long moment. Then she nodded once and allowed the volunteer to lead her family to the field kitchen. The bread incident. That's when David saw something he'd never forget. Carol was given a piece of bread. Standard military ration white bread, probably 4 inches square, nothing special by Canadian standards. Carol took it with both hands, stared at it like it was made of gold, and shoved the entire piece into his mouth at once, and started crying. Not happy crying, panicked crying. He was trying to chew and swallow as fast as possible while tears streamed down his face, choking slightly because he'd stuffed too much in his mouth. His whole body was shaking. David started forward without thinking, worried the boy was choking. But the Dutch volunteer grabbed his arm. Don't. You'll frighten him. He needs to know no one will take it. Take it? We're giving him food. He doesn't believe that yet. Watch his mother. Margaretha was doing the same thing, cramming food into her mouth, crying, shaking. So were Anna and Sophie. Even little Maria, barely 3 years old, was eating with desperate urgency while tears ran down her face. The volunteer explained, for 8 months, they've had almost no food. When food appeared, someone always took it. German soldiers confiscating supplies, desperate neighbors stealing, stronger people taking from weaker. They learned to eat immediately as fast as possible, because hesitation meant starvation. David sat down on the church steps and tried to process what he was seeing. These children had been so traumatized by hunger that receiving food made them cry. They couldn't even experience the joy of eating because they were too terrified of losing the food. That's when David opened his can of beef stew and realized he couldn't eat it. How could he eat while watching children sob over bread? The Long Road to Trust, May 8th, 1945. The De Vries family came back the next day, and the next, and the next. But they wouldn't speak to David, wouldn't make eye contact. They'd take food from the Dutch volunteers, eat it with that same desperate urgency, and leave. On the 4th day, David tried something different. When Carol approached for his meal, David didn't look at him, just handed the food to the volunteer while seemingly occupied with something else. gave Carol space to take the food without feeling watched. Carol took the food, and instead of immediately running, sat down on the ground 20 feet away to eat, still eating fast, still crying, but staying nearby. Progress. On the 5th day, Anna stayed too. On the 6th day, all 4 children sat within sight of the field kitchen while eating, still frightened, still ready to run, but staying. Margareta remained standing, always positioned between her children and the soldiers, ready to grab them and flee if needed. She never relaxed, never sat, never turned her back on the Canadians. David understood. He had a mother back home. He knew mothers would die before they let anyone hurt their children. Margareta had kept 4 children alive through 8 months of hell. She wasn't going to trust foreign soldiers just because they wore different uniforms. On May 12th, something changed. Little Maria, the 3-year-old, was given a cup of milk, real milk, something she'd probably never tasted. She drank it slowly, then looked up at David with milk on her upper lip and smiled. It was a tiny smile, barely visible, but it was there. David felt his throat tighten. He smiled back and waved. Maria waved back. Margareta saw the exchange. David watched her face, watched her try to decide if this was safe, if this soldier was genuine, if she could let her guard down, even slightly. Then she did something that almost made David cry. She sat down. For the first time in a week, she sat down while her children ate, still watchful, still ready to move, but sitting. The translator, Father Henrik. David needed help understanding the family, so he sought out Father Henrik, a Dutch priest who spoke fluent English and had been helping coordinate relief efforts. Father Henrik knew the De Vries family well. Before the war, Father Henrik explained, Margareta's husband, Peter, was a schoolteacher. They had a small house near the canal. Not wealthy, but comfortable, happy. The children were in school, well-fed, normal. In 1943, the Germans took Peter for forced labor in Germany. Margareta never saw him again. She learned later he died in a factory accident or was killed. The reports are unclear. She was alone with 4 children. The occupation got worse. Food disappeared. Margareta sold everything, furniture, clothes, her wedding ring, family heirlooms. When she had nothing left to sell, she walked to farms outside the city trying to trade labor for food. Sometimes she walked 30 kilometers round trip and came back with a single potato. The children learned to be quiet. Noise attracted attention. Soldiers, police, desperate neighbors. Anyone might take what little food they had. So the children learned silence. Carol, the oldest, became fiercely protective of his sisters. Anna learned to hide food in places soldiers wouldn't find. Sophie learned to cry silently so neighbors wouldn't hear. Maria barely remembers life before hunger. By January, they were eating tulip bulbs and grass. By March, they had nothing. Margareta was giving her children her rations and slowly starving herself. She'd decided that if they all couldn't survive, she'd at least save her children. Then you came. Father Henrik looked at David with an expression that was hard to read. You need to understand, the priest said. These children don't remember safety. They don't remember trust. They've spent their entire conscious memory in fear and hunger. You're trying to teach them something they've never known. That's not a week's work. That's months, maybe years. The breakthrough, May 18th, 1945. David's unit was being rotated out soon. They'd been fighting since D-Day, and after Germany's surrender, they were heading home. David had maybe 2 weeks left in Rotterdam. He wanted to do something meaningful before he left, so he asked Father Henrik to translate a message for the De Vries family. On May 18th, with Father Henrik translating, David sat down near, but not too near, Margareta and her children. Mrs. De Vries, he said, I want you to know something. I have 4 younger brothers in Canada. The youngest is named Michael. He's 7 years old, about Carol's age. Before I came here, I thought I was fighting to defeat Germany. I thought I understood what that meant. But I didn't understand. Not really. I didn't understand what the Germans did to your family, to your children. I didn't understand what it meant to make children afraid of food, afraid of soldiers, afraid of everything. My mother taught me that the opposite of war isn't peace. It's family. It's children playing. It's mothers who don't have to watch their babies starve. I can't give you back your husband. I can't give you back the years you lost. But I promise you, the men who did this to you will never hurt you again. You're safe now. Your children are safe. And they're going to grow up. And they're going to have children of their own. And those children will never know hunger. Father Henrik translated. Margareta listened without expression. When Father Henrik finished, Margareta was silent for a long moment. Then she spoke. Her voice was hoarse. David learned later that malnutrition had damaged her vocal cords. Father Henrik translated her response. She says, I don't know if I believe you. I want to believe you, but I've learned not to believe soldiers. But she also says, you fed my children when I couldn't. You gave them bread when I had nothing. You were patient when I was suspicious. For that, she's grateful. And she says, if you're telling the truth, if her children are really safe, then she'll pray for you every day for the rest of her life. Because you gave her something she thought was impossible. You gave her hope. David nodded. He didn't trust himself to speak. The final day is May 20th, 23 in 1945. David's unit was shipping out on May 24th. He spent his last few days in Rotterdam teaching the De Vries children something they'd forgotten. How to play. He'd brought a soccer ball from the supplies regulation military equipment that he'd requisitioned by claiming it was for civilian morale purposes, which was technically true. On May 20th, he brought the ball to the courtyard and started kicking it around by himself. Carol watched from his usual spot. After 10 minutes, David deliberately kicked the ball too hard. It rolled toward Carol. Carol looked at the ball, looked at David, looked at the ball. David gestured. Kick it back. Carol hesitated. Then, carefully, he kicked it. Weakly, he was still very thin, but he kicked it. David kicked it back. Carol kicked it again. They played for 5 minutes, just kicking the ball back and forth. No words, just a simple game. Then Anna joined. Then Sophie. By the end, all 4 De Vries children were kicking the ball around with David. And Margareta was watching with tears in her eyes. Father Henrik, watching from nearby, said, this is the first time I've seen those children play in 2 years. The goodbye, May 23rd, 1945. David's last day in Rotterdam. He'd been avoiding thinking about it, but now it was here. He went to the courtyard one final time. The De Vries family was there. They'd come every day for 3 weeks. Through Father Henrik, David explained, I'm leaving tomorrow. My unit is going home to Canada, but I wanted to give you something before I go. He pulled out a small notebook and wrote down his address in Nova Scotia. He handed it to Margareta through Father Henrik. When mail service is working again, write to me. Tell me how the children are doing. Tell me if you need anything. I can't promise I can help, but I'll try. Margareta took the paper, stared at it, then looked at David. She said something in Dutch. Father Henrik translated. She wants to know why you care. You're leaving. You'll never see us again. Why does it matter to you what happens to her family? David had been thinking about that question for days. He answered honestly, because I have brothers. Because my mother taught me that every child matters. And because I need to know that something good came from this war. I need to know that your children will be okay, that they'll grow up safe, that they'll have families of their own someday. I need to know that we didn't fight for nothing. Father Henrik translated. Margareta's eyes filled with tears. Then she did something that shocked David. She stepped forward and hugged him, just for a moment, then stepped back. Through Father Henrik, she says, thank you for giving her children food. Thank you for teaching them to play again. Thank you for helping her believe in safety. She'll write. She promises. Carol stepped forward. He'd been silent the entire time David had known him, 3 weeks, without a single word. Now he spoke. One English word, carefully pronounced. Thank you. David knelt down to Carol's level. You're welcome, buddy. You take care of your mother and your sisters, okay? Carol nodded seriously, like David had given him a mission. The letters, 1945 to 1998. Margareta kept her promise. Shattered wrote. The first letter arrived in September 1945. Dear David, this is Margareta de Vries. Father Henrik is helping me write in English. The children are better. They gained weight. Carol returned to school. Anna helps me in the house. Sophie and Maria play together and laugh. I hear them laugh now. I forgot what that sounded like. Thank you for this, Margareta. David wrote back immediately, asked about the children, sent photographs of his family in Canada, sent a small package of chocolate for the kids. The letters continued. Every few months at first, then more frequently. Dear David, Carol is doing well in school. His teacher says he's very smart. Anna wants to be a nurse. She says she wants to help people like the Canadian soldiers helped us. Sophie drew you a picture. I'm sending it. Maria talks about the soldier who gave us bread. She remembers you. Margareta. In 1947, David got engaged. He wrote to tell Margareta. She wrote back, I'm happy for you. Your wife is lucky. Tell her you saved my family. Tell her you're a good man. In 1948, David got married. In 1949, his first child was born a daughter. He named her Margaret after Margareta. He wrote to tell her, Margareta's response, I cried when I read that you named your daughter for me. I don't deserve this honor. But I thank you. Your Margaret will be beautiful and strong, like all Canadian children who grow up safe. The first return, May 5th, 1955. David returned to Rotterdam in 1955 for the 10th anniversary of Liberation Day. He'd saved money for years to make the trip. The De Vries family met him at the train station. He almost didn't recognize them. Carol was 20, tall and healthy, studying to be an engineer. Anna was 18, training to be a nurse like she'd dreamed. Sophie was 15 in school. Maria was 13, healthy and happy. And Margareta looked younger, still thin, still bearing the marks of starvation. But her eyes were different, less haunted, more alive. They spent 3 days together. Margareta showed David the house they'd rebuilt, introduced him to neighbors who'd survived, took him to the memorial for those who didn't. On Liberation Day, May 5th, they stood together at the commemoration ceremony. When the moment of silence came, Margareta reached over and took David's hand. After the ceremony, she spoke through a translator. Father Henrik had died in 1952, but others helped now. I want you to meet someone. She brought forward a young man, maybe 25 years old. This is Johan. He's engaged to Anna. He's a good man. He'll take care of her. They want to marry next year. I wanted you to know that Anna will be happy, that your help wasn't wasted. David shook Johan's hand, then hugged Anna. She'd been 8 when he met her, skeletal, terrified, silent. Now she was 18, healthy, and planning a wedding. Thank you, Anna said in careful English, for my life. The pattern, 1955 to 1998. David returned to Rotterdam every 5 years, 1955, 1960, 1965, 1970, 1975, 1980, 1985, 1990, 1995. Every trip the family gathered. Every trip they'd walk through Rotterdam, now rebuilt and prosperous. Every trip they'd visit memorials for those who didn't survive. And every trip the family got bigger. 1960, Carol married. His wife was expecting. 1965, David met Carol's daughter named Margot after Margareta. Anna had 2 children. 1970, Sophie married. Maria was engaged. 1975, the family had expanded to 12 people. 3 generations. 1980, 4 generations. Margareta was a great-grandmother. 1985, the family filled a restaurant. 23 people, all descended from the 4 skeletal children David had met in 1945. 1990, David brought his whole family, his wife, his 3 children, his 6 grandchildren. 2 families intertwined by history. 1995. Margareta, now 82 and in declining health, told David, "I've lived to see my children's children's children. I thought I would die in 1945. You gave me 50 more years. Thank you." The final letter, January 1998. Dear David, this is Carol de Vries. I'm writing to tell you that my mother, Margareta, died peacefully last night. She was 85 years old. At the end, she was surrounded by her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. 47 people came from her 4 children. 47 lives that exist because you fed us bread in May 1945. Before she died, she asked me to write to you. She wanted you to know you gave her more than food. You gave her hope that the world could be good again. You taught her children to trust again. You made her believe that soldiers could be kind. She said you were the first person who made her feel human again after years of being treated like something less than human. She wanted to thank you one more time, and she wanted you to know. She prayed for you every single day for 53 years, just like she promised. We're planning a memorial for May 5th, Liberation Day. If you can come, we'd be honored. Your family. Always, Carol. Liberation Day, May 5th, 1998. David, now 76 years old, made one more trip to Rotterdam. The ceremony was in the rebuilt church near where the field kitchen had been 53 years earlier. 47 people attended, children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren of Margarethe de Vries. Carol gave a speech. In May 1945, my mother thought we were going to die. We'd been starving for 8 months. We weighed almost nothing. We were too frightened to trust anyone. When Canadian soldiers arrived, we didn't see liberators. We saw more men with guns, more uniforms, more threats. But one soldier saw us, not as Dutch civilians, not as victims, not as statistics, as humans, as a family who needed help. That soldier was David Walsh. He fed us when we had nothing. He was patient when we were afraid. He taught us to play when we'd forgotten how. He gave my mother hope when she had none left. Because of his kindness, I'm alive. My sisters are alive. Our children and grandchildren are alive. 47 people are here today because one Canadian private cared about 4 starving children. David, you once told my mother that you needed to know something good came from the war. I want you to know. Look around this room. This is what came from the war. This is what your kindness created. 47 lives. 47 futures. All because you saw us as worth saving. Thank you. From all of us. Thank you. David couldn't speak. He just stood and waved at the room full of people. A family that existed because he'd once given bread to a frightened boy. Epilogue. David Walsh died in 2001 at age 79. At his funeral in Nova Scotia, a delegation of 12 people arrived from the Netherlands, the de Vries family, representing the 47 who couldn't make the journey. They brought a gift, a plaque, reading, "To the soldier who taught us to trust again. Thank you for our lives. The de Vries family, 47 souls." Every Liberation Day, the de Vries family places flowers at the memorial in Rotterdam. And every year they say a prayer for David Walsh, the Canadian private who saved them. Not by heroic combat, not by grand strategy, but by being patient with frightened children, by giving food without demanding gratitude, by teaching traumatized kids how to play again, by seeing 4 starving children and deciding they mattered. That's the opposite of war. That's what peace looks like. 1 soldier, 1 family, 47 lives.